You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. The British government has outlined plans that would force internet service providers to keep a record of every user's phone calls, emails and web use. Under the new Communications Data Bill, the government hopes to extend the access that the police and security services have to the public's communications data. The government say the new bill will allow police and security authorities to monitor the activities of terrorists and serious criminals who are exploiting modern forms of communications. But critics warn that the plans are an unnecessary intrusion into people's privacy and could be open to abuse. Joining me to discuss the implications of the Communications Data Bill are Nick Pickles, the director of Big Brother Watch, a campaign group dedicated to defending civil liberties and protecting privacy. Lawrence Kay is the leader of Pirate Party UK, a political party which stands for digital rights and civil liberties. Annesley Abercorn is the British Parliamentary Advisor, and Gary Butridge is from the Association of Chief Police Officers, and he's the organisation's lead on data communications. Gary Butridge from the Association of Chief Police Officers, how crucial is it that you have access to this data?
Well, I believe it's very crucial. Accessing data, communications data, is now a core part of any significant investigation. Indeed, I think every terrorist investigation in recent years has relied on that type of evidence. Criminals communicate using whatever communications means are available. Those communications methods have changed significantly in recent years. No longer do people just rely on hardline telephones or mobile telephones. Increasingly, people are using the internet through which to communicate. And I believe that as long as the police can access that information in a way that's necessary, justified and proportional, then we should have access to it in furtherance of criminal investigations.
Nick Pickles, the director of Big Brother Watch, that's perfectly reasonable, isn't it?
Well, if it was a fair representation of what's being proposed. I mean, firstly, this bill explicitly applies to things sent through the Royal Mail. It includes postcards. So the idea this is about new technology simply doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Secondly, if we look at international experience here in Germany, for example, their detection rate and their rate of solving crimes went down when they introduced their data retention laws. And indeed, they quite reasonably just demonstrated that the people you are trying to stop will use very easily available avoidance techniques. And so, as David Davis has said, the only people you catch are the innocent and the incompetent.
Annesley Abercorn.
I think the system we've got at the moment is not satisfactory, and we need a little bit more leeway that gives the police a bit more flexibility. For example, you have millions of people posting very hurtful, sometimes racially abusive comments on various blogs under a pseudonym. You get many occasions where the police actually try to find out who is behind such comments, and they have to go through so many hurdles in order to do so. It is very demoralising for the people that are being talked about, because they feel they can't do anything without being subjected to thousands of pounds worth of legal fees, going through the High Court to reveal IP addresses, and even then there is no guarantee of actually seeing who the perpetrator is. So I think that there has to be something to be done. I agree we shouldn't be talking about monitoring content of emails and going that far. I mean, that's something that we have to be careful not to restrict civil liberties. That's something we enjoy in this country, but we cannot possibly carry on the situation we are in at the moment, where the internet hasn't got the same degree of accountability as the broadcast or print media, and that's what we should be aiming for.
Loz Kay, the leader of Pirate Party UK, we need more accountability online.
Well, what you've just been describing is actually nothing to do with the Communications Data Bill. There are provisions coming up in the Defamation Bill for the kind of situations that you're describing. But in fact, there are, with all the things that have been mentioned so far, perfectly reasonable powers, or at least powers which have some kind of oversight. What's being asked for in the Communications Data Bill is every bit as bad as we feared. It's intercepting information on websites visited. It's names of email and instant messaging contacts. It's social network friends, time, size and length of internet phone calls. Essentially, this bill makes us all suspects. Now, the way that we've been sold this bill is that that content is not going to be monitored. But anyone who knows anything about data will tell you that this is highly disingenuous. From web use, the authorities can make a picture of every website you visit, so where you shop, what papers you read, and whether you visit the website of your local place of worship. In short, anyone who spends any length of time online, that this can build up a picture of who you are and what you think. Now, if the intention is not to use this data, then the government should not be asking for it.
Well, the thing is, the government say that a court warrant is going to be needed if police want to have access to the phone calls and emails, and only the authorities will be able to then see who, when, where and how, but not the content of it.
Well, those warrants aren't court warrants. This again is something that's been quite disingenuous, is the government has come out with a concession saying that local authorities will require a judicial warrant. That's less than 1% of the current communications data. Everything else never goes before a judge. And on the issue of existing powers, right now the police can tap into your internet connection and see everything you do without ever having to go before a court. As Lol said, this is about everyone being suspect. If there is reasonable grounds to investigate someone right now, we can tap your phones, we can follow you in the street, we can put hidden cameras in your house. It's not a lack of powers. This is indiscriminate surveillance.
Well, I think...
Go on, Annesley.
Well, I just think that, sometimes the reality of the situation can be very different to, what it may sound like. And I think, the reality is, I've been subject to all sorts of miscellaneous blogs in the past online, which I've tried to get taken down, some with success, some with less success. And the reason why I have failed in the other cases, because the police simply don't have the flexibility or the power to get behind the perpetrators instantly, quickly and affordably, and hopefully this will allow that to happen.
Gary Butridge from the Association of Chief Police Officers. As far as Nick and Loz are concerned, everyone is a suspect.
Well, I would disagree with that. I would say that the most fundamental role of the police is guardianship, and that means looking after vulnerable people. So if in the course of an investigation we believe that there are people using communications methods for illicit purposes, whether that's child exploitation, robbery, kidnap, murder, etc., then as long as there is a sufficient justifiable process that is undertaken, which there currently is, these applications go through very senior police officers who look at a necessity test, they look at what is the reasoned approach for making this application, and then these applications are subsequently scrutinised by the Information Commissioner and then can be scrutinised in terms of legality and process in a court of law. As long as those threshold tests are met, then I believe there are sufficient safeguards. Absolutely, nobody would want to live in a tyranny, me included, and we have to be cognizant of human rights issues. But I believe the existing safeguards do provide that level of security, that level of assurance that what is being done properly and appropriately. The reality is there is a significant hole in the armoury of law enforcement to be able to take on sophisticated criminality who use ever-increasingly complex methods to communicate. And what we're asking for is just to maintain current capability in the face of changing technology.
Loz Kay, leader of the Pirate Party UK.
Of course, I agree entirely. That's the role of policing, is to be protecting the vulnerable. But also sometimes actually too much information is as big a problem as not enough information. It's actually, well, the type of data retention that we're talking about is, again, it's about wiretapping an entire nation. We've actually
had. But the government say they need this.
Yes,
they say they need access.
It's actually but it's really interesting because it's been we've had these kind of scaremongering pictures, these sound bites of it's an issue of life and death. Well, actually, what's being asked for is only useful in retrospect. This vast amount of data and how it's to be made in an intelligible form. We're really talking about life and death situations, I'm afraid this is actually just a kind of Jack Bauer type fantasy. fantasy of 24/7 real-time intelligence, and this is also simply not possible, and in fact is not what's being proposed either. So it simply is not fit for the purpose that it's being sold as.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna with today's discussion on the implications of the government's communications data bill. Joining me are Nick Pickles from Big Brother Watch, Lawrence Kay, the leader of the Pirate Party UK, Annesley Abercorn, a British parliamentary advisor, and Gary Butridge from the Association of Chief Police Officers. The government and the police believe that the existing legislation on this isn't enough. It's not giving them enough access to the modern communications that they need to track terrorists and serious criminals. Nick Pickles, if they need extra powers, surely this is just in the form of the communications data bill.
Well, firstly, let's remember that the people in the bill this says itself, the biggest beneficiaries of this will be the taxman. The soundbite about this is a matter of life and death. No, it's not. It's a matter of pounds and pence. And HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, will be one of the people who can get this data that's got nothing to do with terrorism and everything to do with tax. So there is a financial incentive here.
Gary, quite interestingly, HMRC, Revenue and Customs, are going to have access to some of this material. Why would they need access to this?
If they are looking to prosecute people who are fraudulently not paying their tax, and they're conducting their own investigations, then I would surmise that is the reason why. My particular sphere of influence is on behalf of law enforcement, so I wouldn't want to put myself up as being a spokesman for Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, but they do conduct their own investigations, and some of these investigations are at the peak of organised criminality in relation to fraud and tax offences. So I think as long as they go through the same proportionality test, quite legitimately they could make a case for accessing this data.
Now, Nick, under this new law, it will replace the old law where 650 public bodies and around 474 local councils and government agencies had access to our data. This new bill bans all of those bodies from having access to our material, apart from police, security agencies and Revenue and Customs. That's got to be a good thing in the bill, surely.
Well, firstly, it doesn't ban them access to the data that's already held. Public authorities, with the exception of local authorities, will still be able to access existing data. So that's things like information held by your phone company. The extended data will be available to those bodies on application to a court, and indeed anybody else who goes to a court. And I think one thing we can guarantee is when private companies are forced to hold this data, you will then see other private companies going to court to try and get that data. So we've already seen situations, the ACS law case, Telefonica, private companies suing ISPs to get data for their own legal action that's got nothing to do with national security. So if they wanted to restrict it to purely national security grounds, there wouldn't be a massive list in the bill that says the reasons that data can be disclosed include economic interests of the UK, public health, and various other reasons, and anything else the Home Secretary may decree without parliamentary approval. There's a huge amount of vagueness in this bill, and fundamentally, let's remember that it involves installing hardware on the British internet network, and you only need to look at what Oxford and Cambridge University are saying about this is going to increase the vulnerability of UK PLC, both protecting our companies, but also once these black boxes are in, if you're a foreign government, you don't need a spy anymore. You just need to go after one of these boxes, which is going to be operated in an ISP, potentially overseas. They're huge vulnerabilities for the UK's national security.
Annesley Abercorn, this is going to be very vulnerable for the UK's interests and in terms of spying from other countries. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the Home Office and the security services should be very selective in the data that they wish to hold and how they go about the criteria that determines whether they go after that data. They should only go after suspects that have a proven record of criminality, possibly using internet and other sources, and that's a way to sort of really hone in on those areas of crime. I agree that we should be very careful not to make sure this data is properly secured and away from potential countries getting access to it from abroad. Maybe it should be purely a domestically based appliance that's installed, and those safeguards have to be put in place.
Gary, police and security authorities already have powers in the form of the current legislation to access phone and email records and also some web use. Why do police feel the need to have even more power?
Because quite simply, the information that we access routinely is not kept by internet service providers, and people are changing the way in which they communicate. We estimate that there would be a gap approaching 25% at the moment because of the changing nature of people's communications methods and in respect to the information we would like to access in furtherance of criminality and crimes in action. It's a fact that if you look at data records, people are now communicating less on hardline telephones and on mobile telephones, and they're using more web-based applications, and that's an increasing phenomena, and this gap will just continue to grow.
And as the Abercorn, the police obviously need these powers. As far as Gary is concerned and the government are concerned, it's got to be a good step in the right direction.
I think the bill has to be looked at very carefully. We don't want to overstep the line. We don't want, we don't want people looking at content of emails and conversations and all the rest of it. That should be kept private. But I think having an idea as to which internet sites people are going to, for example, if you have somebody you think is posting illegal material on a website, and if you have a strong suspicion who it might be, my understanding, I could be wrong, but my understanding is that under this new legislation, the police will be easily able to track the kind of websites that person is associating themselves with and actually using, and can make a link that way, and that surely has to be a good thing. I mean, it could save people's lives. It could, this sort of thing against other people has deep psychological effects, and surely, some way of making it easier to track down the perpetrators has to be a good thing. And if we can find, a middle way whereby we can make it easier for the police to do that without restricting civil liberty, then I think that has to be the way forward. There'll never be a perfect solution, but the situation we have at the moment simply isn't satisfactory.
Loz Kay, the leader of the Pirate Party, at the moment, Annesley is saying they need the ability to track down these people. If you've got nothing to hide, why should you be worried?
Well, this is one of the favourite mantras. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. Everyone in this country has a lot to fear. But from what is extraordinary about what we've just heard is the amazing U-turn of the Conservative Party on this issue. Only back as recently as 2009, we were hearing completely the opposite, the opposite tones. And David Cameron himself was talking about how Labour grasp for information and using scare tactics to be able to get what they want. Essentially, this is even going back on what was written into the coalition agreement.
The U-turn isn't important to the question. My question was, Annesley says it's going to be easy to track down suspects.
The U-turn is fundamental to the whole question about why are they bringing forward this legislation now when it was when it was precisely the opposite was in the coalition agreement. There was a promise to end storage of internet and email records for no good reason. Well, storing the entire nation's internet and email records is no good reason.
Well,
so not only is
between storage and access, isn't there? I mean, and also the other thing to bear in mind.
But that's what you're asking for.
The other thing to bear in mind is that 2009 is 3 years ago. 2010, when the coalition agreement was drawn up, is 2 years ago. The way in which people use smartphones and the increase of portable mobile technology has really, there's been a transformation in the last 3 years. So I think, you can't blame a government for trying to review the situation as time goes on, as technology improves.
Nick Pickles, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. Loz Kay says it's the usual mantra, but it seems to be at the heart of some of the key arguments for this data bill. It's worth sacrificing some freedoms to protect others, and if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. What are your thoughts?
Well, for example, this will mean that if I visit alcoholicsanonymous.com, there will be a database held by a private company, not by the state, which records that information. You don't need to know what I did on that website to infer something, which you could then later use against me. So it'd be paradise for people who want to blackmail people, because if you're ringing phone numbers which are known to be associated with escorts, this will kill whistleblowing dead. something else that needs to be discussed.
But this is going to be kept separate. This is going to be kept by the internet service providers where they are. It's not going to be have access to anyone who wants to blackmail you. I can't access it and go, hey, Nick, I saw you want Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm going to blackmail you about that.
And so that was exactly what was said before phone hacking, about people's medical records, and about the contents of communications on voicemails, and about police databases. Several hundred staff have been disciplined in the past few years for misusing their access to databases. And in Germany, someone walked out of Deutsche Telekom with a DVD with several million people's website history on them, information explicitly stored because the state wanted it. So
this is just a question of keeping that information safe then. It's not a question about whether we should have access to it. It's if we do have access to it, let's keep it safe.
And I think it's very, very easy to say. I mean, look at HMRC. This was an organisation that put 23 million people's bank details in the post. Now, the idea that in this day and age there is any way to say when we hold data, it is without any risk whatsoever. And this is the one reason why Labour proposed a central database. It's much more secure. If GCHQ hold this information, it's much less likely to leak or be lost or be stolen. So that was one reason why the central database was proposed, was it eliminates risk. But I want to go back to a much more fundamental question, which is that no other democratic state in the world requires the conversations that we have to be recorded. So right now, this bill says if I make a phone call, if I send someone an email, if I visit a website, if I send someone a Facebook message, it must be recorded who I have spoken to.
My understanding is they're not. Going to actually record the content of conversations.
And this is where one of the big questions has to be asked: is if I send an encrypted email, you can't tell the difference between what is content and what is header. You have to store the whole thing, or you have to break that email's encryption. And right now, I tell you what: if you use online banking, or if you use secure communications to protect your company's intellectual property, this should really worry you, because it will break a very, very important part of the internet's backbone for security, which is HTTPS encryption, which is something we use every day to make sure people can't steal our credit card details.
A reminder that you're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna with today's discussion on the implications of the government's communications data bill. Joining me are Nick Pickles from Big Brother Watch, Lawrence Kay, the leader of the Pirate Party UK, Annesley Abercorn, a British parliamentary advisor, and Gary Butridge from the Association of Chief Police Officers. Gary Butridge, we mentioned before about sacrificing other freedoms to protect others. Do you think this is necessary within the communications data bill, that people do give up some of their privacy so that police can know who is contacting who, when, where and how? This is a necessary step for the police?
Quite clearly, it's the job of government to legislate and not the police, or the police to try and influence that, but to point out where the gaps are. I'll just make one very quick point, that communications data is about the time, duration, numbers, or an email address. It absolutely is not about the content of the communication. But I go back to what I said earlier. The job of the police is to protect vulnerable people and to be able to take on organised criminality, serious crime and terrorism. At the moment, there is a gap in our ability to do so. My understanding is that this bill is about maintaining capability. It is not about increasing capability. It's about maintaining it in the face of changing communications methods. And there is a widening gap that blunts the ability of law enforcement to protect people. And that is what the police are all about.
Critics of the bill, including two of those sitting in the studio and also backbench MPs from the Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties, warned that this could now be open to abuse. What measures have you got in place to ensure that that doesn't happen?
Well, there are very, very robust measures in place. This type of evidence and intelligence is treated with the utmost professionalism by specifically and specially trained officers who are accredited in its use. There's high levels of security around how the police actually manage data with inspections, and it is capable and is inspected through external inspection by the Communications Commissioner, through court processes, and through our own internal justification procedures, which are inspected as well.
What about how it's stored? You know, we are now saying to internet service providers that they are going to be storing a huge amount of data. Can we really trust them to handle this data responsibly? They're not police, are they?
Well, again, I believe that's a matter for government to deal with internet service providers in much the same way as they do so with communication service providers. And there will have to be standards and inspection regimes linked to that to ensure compliance. But this is about asking ISPs to keep data or keep records of data that hitherto they have not, that can then be examined once proper processes are in place to justify the access of that information.
Nick Pickles, Director of Big Brother Watch.
Well, I think there's 2 points quickly to make. Firstly, I think Gary and I would agree on this. The biggest vulnerability the police have right now is that they don't have the resources in individual police forces to deal with the data they recover from crime scenes. So if there's a raid on a mid-level drug dealer, they'll recover laptops and phones, and they might be encrypted. It's very difficult for the police to actually find the resources right now to deal with all that information. And I think that would be a much more effective use of the £2 billion we're talking about, is to more effectively fund local law enforcement. But let's look at what the actual experts have said. The 7/7 inquest went into detail about the amount of surveillance and communications data available, and it concluded that more surveillance and more communications data would not have been useful because the people involved were taking the utterly trivial step of using more than one prepay mobile phone. Now, I'm sorry, but all the surveillance in the world will be defeated by very, very simple technical steps, many of which are perfectly legal and are available right now. So the idea that this will fix the problem is ridiculous. We're going to have the same conversation in 2 years, saying we need even more power because people are avoiding it. That's exactly what happened in Germany.
Annesley Abercorn, is this going to be a matter of police getting these powers now, security services saying they need more powers later? This kind of slippery slope argument it is traditionally.
Well, we shouldn't be... technology is changing all the time, and we shouldn't be afraid of review. I wouldn't like to say have more powers. I'd like to say review so that, maybe the nature of the powers that they have in the future may change. I'd like to see a sort of horizontal move. I don't want to see any more infringement of personal liberty or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is that technology is changing all the time. We don't know what the internet and what devices are going to be around in 5-10 years down the line. This will always have to be reviewed, and I think that's the spirit upon which we should enter this bill. It's in its early stages. It's still subject to possible change. When it goes in, it'll be under review. It should continue to be reviewed as technology changes. And it changes so fast. The way in which you're going to get access data and talk to people is changing all the time. It's becoming faster, it's becoming more instant, and it's becoming more plentiful, and it's becoming more widely used. That has to be taken into consideration moving forward.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thanks to all of my guests. Nick Pickles, the director of Big Brother Watch, a campaign group dedicated to defending civil liberties and protecting privacy. Lawrence Kay is the leader of Pirate Party UK, a political party which stands for digital rights and civil liberties. Annesley Abercorn is a British parliamentary advisor, and Gary Butridge is from the Association of Chief Police Officers, and he's the organisation's lead on data communications. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. The British government has outlined plans that would force internet service providers to keep a record of every user's phone calls, emails and web use. Under the new Communications Data Bill, the government hopes to extend the access that the police and security services have to the public's communications data. The government say the new bill will allow police and security authorities to monitor the activities of terrorists and serious criminals who are exploiting modern forms of communications. But critics warn that the plans are an unnecessary intrusion into people's privacy and could be open to abuse. Joining me to discuss the implications of the Communications Data Bill are Nick Pickles, the director of Big Brother Watch, a campaign group dedicated to defending civil liberties and protecting privacy. Lawrence Kay is the leader of Pirate Party UK, a political party which stands for digital rights and civil liberties. Annesley Abercorn is the British Parliamentary Advisor, and Gary Butridge is from the Association of Chief Police Officers, and he's the organisation's lead on data communications. Gary Butridge from the Association of Chief Police Officers, how crucial is it that you have access to this data?
Well, I believe it's very crucial. Accessing data, communications data, is now a core part of any significant investigation. Indeed, I think every terrorist investigation in recent years has relied on that type of evidence. Criminals communicate using whatever communications.
Actually seeing who the perpetrator is. So I think that there has to be something to be done. I agree we shouldn't, be talking about monitoring content of emails and going that far. I mean, that's something that we have to be careful not to restrict civil liberties. That's something we enjoy in this country. But we cannot possibly carry on with the situation we are in at the moment, where the internet hasn't got the same degree of accountability as the broadcast or print media, and that's what we should be aiming for.
Loz Kay, the leader of Pirate Party UK, we need more accountability online.
Well, what you've just been describing is actually nothing to do with the Communications Data Bill. There are provisions coming up in the Defamation Bill for the kind of situations that you're describing. But in fact, there are, with all the things that have been mentioned so far, perfectly reasonable powers, or at least powers which have some kind of oversight. What's being asked for in the Communications Data Bill is every bit as bad as we feared. It's
means are available. Those communications methods have changed significantly in recent years. No longer do people just rely on hardline telephones or mobile telephones. Increasingly, people are using the internet through which to communicate. And I believe that as long as the police can access that information in a way that's necessary, justified and proportional, then we should have access to it in furtherance of criminal investigations.
Nick Pickles, the director of Big Brother Watch, that's perfectly reasonable, isn't it?
Well, if it was a fair representation of what's being proposed. I mean, firstly, this bill explicitly applies to things sent through the Royal Mail. It includes postcards. So the idea this is about new technology simply doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Secondly, if we look at international experience here in Germany, for example, their detection rate and their rate of solving crimes went down when they introduced their data retention laws. And indeed, they quite reasonably just demonstrated that the people you are trying to stop will use very easily available avoidance techniques. And so, as David Davis has said, the only people you catch are the innocent and the incompetent.
Annesley Abercorn.
I think the system we've got at the moment is not satisfactory, and we need a little bit more leeway that gives the police a bit more flexibility. For example, you have millions of people posting very hurtful, sometimes racially abusive comments on various blogs under a pseudonym. You get many occasions where the police actually try to find out who is behind such comments, and they have to go through so many hurdles in order to do so. It is very demoralising for the people that are being talked about, because they feel they can't do anything without being subjected to thousands of pounds worth of legal fees, going through the High Court to reveal IP addresses, and even then there is no guarantee of